Manisha Sinha, the Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut.
Excellent. And we're going to be discussing your essay in the Wall Street Journal, The Long History of American Slavery Reparations. So if you could kind of give us an overview to accomplish with this essay and maybe a little bit of how it was received.
Well, I became interested in the issue of reparations not because of the modern movement towards reparations, which is how most people hear about it. I became interested in it because I'm a 19th century historian of slavery, abolition, and the Civil War and Reconstruction. And I was writing this big book on abolition, which was published in 2016, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition. And increasingly, I found so many abolitionists, both Black and white, talk about reparations. They didn't call it that. They called it compensation to enslaved people for, centuries of unpaid labor. And they really opposed compensation to slaveholders, which is what was being talked about then by other people at the end of slavery. The British gave slaveholders a lot of money for their, quote, loss of property. And abolitionists tended to oppose that. They saw that as a travesty. So I became increasingly interested in abolitionists who were talking about compensation, people like Garrison, others who got involved in the land reform movement, like Gerrit Smith, who actually distributed land to African Americans so that they could vote in New York because they had to meet a property holding qualification in order to vote, but white men did not. So there was this debate, this talk about compensating enslaved people that went on before the Civil War. And during the Civil War, it kind of enters into mainstream politics with enslaved people asking for land. And with Sherman's famous Field Order Number 15 during the Civil War, that did redistribute land to enslaved people in Low Country, South Carolina and Georgia. And this debate goes on during Reconstruction. I'm currently writing a book on Reconstruction, and this is a big issue. It's not, people think, oh, this is something politically correct. We've just dreamed up of this issue, but actually it's been going on for some time, and its real historical origins was in the time period of both slavery and abolition, and then in the immediate aftermath of slavery in the South.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I think that I would like to touch, in the article you mentioned in 1783, Belinda Sutton became the first woman to win reparations. And could you maybe speak a little bit about how that happened and what Belinda Sutton had to do that?
Yes, so Belinda Sutton was an African-American woman. She was owned by the Suttons. Her petition, Belinda's famous petition that historians have, in the recent past discovered, show that she demanded, compensation for years of labor. And she is what they called in those days a superannuated slave, meaning somebody who was elderly, her years of work and labor were behind her. In a way, she was asking for a pension, virtually, what we would call today a pension. But her claims were well received, not only because she'd never been compensated for her labor, because she had been enslaved. And then Massachusetts had, of course, gotten rid of slavery by that time in the 1780s. And also because her erstwhile master, was a loyalist. And so the Massachusetts General Court, which is what was the name of the state legislature, looked upon her petition favorably, but they were rather miserly. They didn't give her a huge amount, but they did give her something. So this, you could say, was the first demand for years of uncompensated labor under slavery, and it came from an enslaved Black woman.
Yeah, I found that very interesting that the owner was a Tory loyalist, and that's one of the reasons why they didn't like him, so they went ahead and did that. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the Sherman field order, because this happened during the war, correct? This was something that he did as he's doing his famous march through the South, right? We could talk a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. So, you know, when Sherman issued his field order number 15, he just didn't issue it out of the blue. William Sherman was not an abolitionist. He was an adept general, Union Army general, but he was not somebody who had great anti-slavery beliefs or believed in the abolitionist cause. In fact, he was rather conservative on the question of race. But as a general, he had to deal with military logistics, and he had to deal with literally armies of enslaved people who were fleeing for freedom to the Union Army, following him, and in a way, sort of bogging him down in his famous March to the Sea across the South to break the backbone of the Confederacy in 1865. By the time he reaches Savannah, Georgia, he, with Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, Lincoln's Secretary of War, meet with Black leaders from that city. And he's thinking of a way to deal with this problem, what he sees as a problem of contraband of freed people following his army. And indeed, the Union Army had developed, quote, contraband camps, which we call more now refugee camps, because these enslaved people were literally refugees from war. And they asked these African American leaders, many of them are prominent ministers. One of them, interestingly, was named Garrison Frazier, who did a lot of the talking and was named actually after the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, a fact that is not widely known. So Garrison Frazier says, you know, we just want economic independence. What we don't want is to have to labor for our former owners, to be reduced to doing that kind of menial, servile labor for the benefit of someone else, which is what they had done in all the years of slavery. So their concept of freedom included not just full citizenship rights, an opportunity for education and social mobility, but also land, economic independence, and autonomy. And this is an idea that is actually very central to American notions of citizenship and of being a good citizen of the republic. Because old ideas of American republicanism said that you were the most virtuous citizen if you were an independent citizen, somebody who was not too wealthy, but also not somebody who was dependent on someone else, that you could make the best judgment, political judgment, if you're an independent citizen. And this became a way for many, you know, indentured servants in the colonial era. They would get a little bit of they would get freedom dues. They would get, you know, sometimes tools, clothes, a new pair of clothes, etc., and sometimes land. And these were indentured servants who were, you know, indentured only for a short period of years, even though sometimes their masters try to increase their terms of servitude. But for enslaved people to demand this was nothing unusual. It's an old custom. It's an old English custom that they were going back to. But at that time, you know, in the United States, people had forgotten that. They had forgotten that there were other systems of unfree labor that had existed and that other people had received compensation for their labor. Instead, they were simply, you know, thinking about the 19th century, thinking sometimes more about slaveholders than enslaved people. So yes, that was the reason why Sherman issued that field order number 15, giving enslaved people 40 acres of land and a mule from the Union Army to get them started off in those farms. And that's where you get the famous slogan, 40 acres and a mule. And it sort of spread like wildfire amongst enslaved people that maybe land would be redistributed to them. And then maybe their masters, the sort of grand plantation owners, would be punished for their treason and would lose ownership of that land. A lot of land was confiscated during the war by the Lincoln administration and through the Freedmen's Bureau, mainly because of non-payment of taxes. And sometimes agents of the Freedmen's Bureau, especially those who had anti-slavery sympathies, would settle enslaved people or formerly enslaved people on those lands. So there were many such schemes that were, ripe for the taking during the Civil War. Unfortunately, Lincoln was assassinated, and in his place, you got a man who was completely unsympathetic to Black freedom claims, to Black claims for equality, for political rights, and for economic autonomy. And one of the first things he does is actually to return all that land to the former owners. It's one of the reasons why I think Andrew Johnson is widely seen as one of the worst presidents in the history of the United States. So these plans were nipped in the bud, and that was unfortunate. And then once Republicans in Congress start opposing Johnson, because slaveholders are coming back into power and trying to reduce Black people to as close a state of slavery as possible, once they start articulating their plans for Reconstruction, there's again a momentum amongst radicals like Thaddeus Stevens, like George Julian, saying, let's redistribute land. But unfortunately, they can't get the moderates and certainly not the conservatives in their party to come on board. They have a consensus for Black political rights, but they don't for land redistribution. And that was one of the tragedies of Reconstruction.
Yeah, and it seems to be that this debate about, or not, I guess it's not debate, but there were potential starts and stops toward reparations that just constantly got kind of, as you said, nipped in the bud, stopped or rolled back. So prior or after Reconstruction, what happens to the reparation movement as far as like?
So the people who carried the torch for the reparations movement after the overthrow of Reconstruction are, of course, formerly enslaved people, African Americans themselves. And women, again, like Belinda, take the lead here. You have organizations that won pensions for enslaved people. After all, there's a huge pension scheme that is put into place for former Union Army soldiers. And many times, Black Union Army soldiers are either excluded or have to fight to get those pensions. But there is a real momentum amongst African Americans, and they create these organizations of former slaves demanding pension. Unfortunately, they're not successful. And sometimes they are accused of fraud. Remember that they are fighting in the most dismal circumstances at this time. Not only is the promise of some kind of compensation for years of unpaid labor sort of out of the door, but not the system that you have in the South is a system, the Jim Crow system. You have racial segregation, racist terror and lynching, sharecropping, debt peonage. So you have another system of racial oppression being put into place rather than having reparations.
Yeah, that was more to do with the kind of maintaining the status quo for the South than it was to stop reparations, correct?
Yes, and not just status quo, it's like literally going back in time. Because what you had during Reconstruction was at least an attempt to create Black male citizenship and to form interracial democracies in the South. What you have in the South is an overthrow of that project, an overthrow not just of federal laws, but constitutional amendments. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. You have convict lease labor, you have new forms of servitude in the South. And that's why the issue of reparations becomes even more complicated. Reparations first for slavery, and then for another 100 years of racial terror and of new forms of servitude. You have the rise of convict lease labor, of incarceration of Black people at levels that were, that many historians call this like worse than slavery or slavery by another name. It's important to look at that period also, because when one looks at the generational ways in which African Americans have been denied equality or the opportunity to accumulate income and wealth, you have to look at that history, that sorry and long and dismal history of racist oppression in this country, and primarily in the South. Before the Great Migrations, of course, over 90% of the population, Black population, lived in the South. This is also the time when Black people sort of turned then towards self-help and try to create, migrate west, create their own towns, create their own businesses. And that too ends up at, receiving racist Black backlash. We are talking a lot this year about the Tulsa racial massacre that took place in 1921 because it's the centennial of it. But think of that, the so-called Black Wall Street, all those businesses, all those lives completely upended, people killed, businesses burned. They put in insurance claims. They didn't even get insurance for this sort of massive pogrom against them. And Tulsa and some others are some spectacular examples, but this happened regularly. And it happened with the complicity of the state. That's when you think of questions of reparations, for instance, in the German case, and the continuing reparations to victims and their descendants from the Holocaust, and then to the state of Israel. When the state is complicit, either in terms of active involvement of law enforcement, but also turning a blind eye to atrocities and crimes, then the state is liable. And certainly, we could do this at various levels. We could do it at the level of towns and local governments, as in Tulsa, in the level of states. Certainly, most of the southern states would owe enormous reparations to their Black populations, and to the national level for simply not enforcing the rule of the law as far as Black citizens were concerned.
Yeah, that's right. And then there have been some successful, especially I'm thinking of, you mentioned in your article, Georgetown and Virginia Theological College, Seminary, sorry, who have kind of set up reparation programs or systems to kind of redress their history with slavery. So maybe you could talk about kind of how that that's worked out. Yeah.
What's been interesting is to see private entities, universities, and corporations, less corporations, because we know we have dug up their past, many of these insurance companies like Aetna, et cetera, and their complicity with upholding slavery. But they haven't done much soul searching or offered any compensation to anyone. I don't even think they've issued verbal apologies because they don't want to be legally liable. What's interesting is to see this debate go on in universities. And it makes sense that it would, because that's where the histories being uncovered, histories of slavery and racial oppression, that's where we work, and where we can see the connections between the sort of long history of racial oppression to systemic inequalities for people of African descent that exist in the United States even today. So it makes sense that much of this investigation has taken place in universities by historians and sometimes by descendants of people who have been wronged, and that these universities have then taken action. What's interesting for me to note in terms of Georgetown and the Virginia Theological Seminary is that these are religious institutions, where Georgetown is a Jesuit institution. And clearly, as religious institutions, they seem to understand the morality of these issues the way the abolitionists did, perhaps better than other institutions. At least they take their religion seriously enough. They take the moral calling seriously enough to address this. So it's interesting for me to see many of these more liberal religious institutions take the first step. I haven't seen any of the really rich universities like Harvard, like Yale or Princeton do anything except to research their own history. But Georgetown has a systemic plan because it was one incident of a massive sale of enslaved people owned by the university and sent to New Orleans, to Louisiana, and they were able to trace the descendants of those enslaved people who were sold down south and make direct reparations to them. So it's a very specific case. So that helps too. Whether that is sufficient to offer them admissions or education at the university, which is what they feel they can do, is another matter. But yes.
Okay, well, I think we can wrap up with this idea of you wrap your article up with kind of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission model. And that's one thing that I was really fascinated with when I learned about it in South Africa. And I wonder if how you would see that even happening here, especially when the lost cause narrative of the South is still so prevalent. And I mean, we've seen it, unfortunately, the last 4 years kind of really come to the forefront. So if you could maybe, we'll kind of wrap it all up with that.
Absolutely. So, the reason why I recommend a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the United States is because I think most ordinary Americans have never grappled with the history of slavery and the history of Jim Crow and disenfranchisement and lynching and racial terror in this country. And if you look at the period when Confederate monuments were put up in this country, and when the lost cause mythology of the South came to dominate both popular and academic understandings of slavery, you see this happening precisely at this period with the overthrow of Reconstruction. There were people who contested it. There were African Americans, descendants of abolitionists, racial liberals, progressives, but they were in the minority. The mainstream was, from Birth of a Nation to the emergence of the Second Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, when they marched down the streets of Washington, D.C. And when you had these really ugly Confederate monuments in that monumental style and the heroic style being put up. And the people today who still champion those values of racism and white supremacy go naturally back to these Confederate monuments, because that's precisely what they stand for. They stand for slavery. They stand for white supremacy. They stand for ideas that became unpopular in the United States with the rise of Nazism and its defeat. But it has now resurged in a political movement, in a crude political movement, where people are not just afraid to wave the Confederate battle flag, but that they are also using Nazi symbols and Nazi ideas. So I really think this is more than a question of black versus white or white versus black. It's really a question of human rights and decent human beings against people who appeal to the worst in our natures. And that's why I think a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a good starting point. The very fact that many of our historical research on issues of slavery, much of it which, is a product of debate and contestation between scholars, is being attacked politically. These are the same people who bemoan political correctness, but for a long time, they taught mythic and ahistorical and sometimes blatantly wrong history, just factually wrong history. And these are the people who want to undo academic freedom, who want to undo research on history. It's very similar to the way they attacked scientists over the issue of climate change. It's politically motivated. There is no attempt to stand up for any idea of truth. And dissent is the highest form of patriotism in a democracy. And I think most of these people don't have a basic understanding, not just of uh, the issues of slavery and racial oppression. They don't have an understanding of American republicanism and democracy. They don't know that Abraham Lincoln, the most beloved American president, began his career by opposing the war against Mexico as a land grab for slavery. You think of anti-war people and they're seen as unpatriotic. Well, what do you make of that? And those are the kinds of things and facts that our students should be exposed to be good citizens. This is true patriotism. You would be able to uphold the ideals of American republicanism much better if you were acquainted with the history, with the controversy over slavery, with the ways in which abolition and emancipation came about. And I think this is a dire necessity today for the fate of American democracy. When, luckily not a majority, but when a significant minority of American citizens still espouse these racist ideas, and because our political system is gerrymandered to favor this minority from the South, from unpopulated areas in the West, their representatives, they openly espouse these ideas. So I think it really is a matter of education. And you can see this happening in all these laws that are being passed by the no longer party of Lincoln, but the party of the Neo-Confederacy in the South, in the West, in some places where Republicans are in control, where they want to, in a very Orwellian way, mandate what can be taught and what can't be taught. Today they're demonizing critical race theory. Well, 50 years ago, they demonized secular humanism, which is, after all, America's heritage, the heritage of the Enlightenment, right? It's very tragic to see these people claim the mantle of patriotism. It's really jingoism of the worst kind. It's what the fascists and the Nazis did to manipulate history, to tell half truths in order to advance a pernicious political agenda. That's why I think the first step, and this is not the last step, but the first step is really one of education, of having something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that South Africa had to deal with its own sorry history of apartheid. We haven't dealt with the history of Southern apartheid in this country, what we called Jim Crow, leave alone, the history of slavery and its long afterlives. So I think that is important, especially now that we have seen a concerted backlash against the civil rights movement, a concerted attempt to undo voting rights. This is exactly what happened during Reconstruction, when Southerners, through a program of voter intimidation and suppression, and through sheer racist terror, undid Reconstruction in the 19th century. They did the same with the second reconstruction of democracy. We saw that concerted attempt politically in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. We are still living with that legacy and those same contestations over citizenship and democracy. And this is where I think we need that kind of commission, where people can come with open minds, and talk about our history. And I do this all the time in my classroom. Not every student that walks into my big Civil War lecture course is necessarily identified with liberal or progressive causes. They are just ordinary students who want to learn. And whose ideas about certain things may actually be quite different than mine politically, but they're open to learning. And that's what's important. It's important to create that space. And that's why I think the attacks on the 1619 Project, which was a journalistic attempt to popularize the histories of slavery in this country and the long histories of racism, is unfortunate. I may not agree with everything they have to say, but I think it's a very worthy attempt, and I would defend it rather than attack it. I would say that, in fact, most Americans should engage those ideas. And one way to engage it would be through a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where people don't come with hardbound ideas right off. And then maybe we can get a debate about reparations going. You can't talk about policy without educating people on this. Again, as a historian of abolition, I see this. I mean, abolitionists struggled from being this despised minority for decades before they were able to get an anti-slavery Republican Party and Lincoln elected. Now, agreed, the South kind of seceded when that happened, and we had the Civil War, etc. And hopefully that doesn't happen. But it takes long years of agitation, of education, to get people to recognize something that is staring them right in the face.